Today, we'll be moving on from quantitative data to survey methods and user experience. Now, survey methods can be quantitative or qualitative, and so they sit sort of in the middle of these two approaches. So why are survey methods important to understand as part of human-computer interaction? Well, not every question that you might want to answer works with popular quantitative methods. For example, some of the things we talked about with regards to task logging and quantitative measurements. A lot of the questions we want to ask simply can't be answered using these data points. When we think about surveys, it's also important to think about validity. Validity is dramatically improved when the results are triangulated from multiple data sources. So often we need to combine survey methods with quantitative methods and qualitative methods to create multiple perspectives on the same answer. And finally, badly designed surveys will provide invalid results. This wastes your time and it wastes your respondents' time. So having a well-designed survey can be a really nice way to bulk up your results, and it's important that that's done in a valid way. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it? So let's talk a little bit about surveys. Surveys allow researchers, designers, developers, anyone who's interested in evaluating. It allows them to capture high-level information about user experiences, attitudes, and perceptions. There are some things that surveys are good at, and there's some things that surveys are bad at. So we'll talk a little bit about when you might choose to use a survey during this lecture. Now, a well-designed survey provides useful insights. A poorly designed survey or a poorly analyzed survey is just noise. As I said, you don't want to waste your time or your respondents' time, so ensuring that you're doing this in a valid way is super important. In your computing science career, you might have to write more surveys than you think. This comes up all the time. For example, class reps often have to administer surveys and report the survey results. Doing this in a rigorous way is going to make a big difference to how that feedback can be incorporated in the future. For your projects at all stages of your university education, you'll probably also have to design some kind of survey questions. And we'll talk a lot about the different types of questions that you might ask, but you're more than likely going to need to do this before you graduate. And again, I don't want anyone to waste their time working on a survey or administering a survey that's not going to give you valid results that you can be confident in. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of questions surveys are actually good for. Surveys can be really useful at looking at user attitudes. For example, acceptance of a new technology, and this can even be measured over time. Surveys are also good at understanding user intentions and motivations. It's often best to do this kind of thing in situ, and you can get a lot of good insights in the moment when someone's interacting with a system about their current intentions. You can also find things out about task success. So many surveys are completed right after a task, and you can kind of combine the quantitative performance with the qualitative results of the survey to understand how successful the user was at completing their task. User experience feedback. This is also something that's good for surveys. We can have open-ended feedback, for example, the open-ended feedback questions that you often see on websites. It's a good way to gather user experience data. You can also understand something about the user characteristics. So often surveys will ask demographic questions relevant to the population. For example, if you were running a survey in an online forum, you might want to know what kind of people are on that forum. So user characteristics are a good kind of attribute to gather during a survey. You can also use surveys to think about interactions with specific technologies. So surveys can capture the self-reports of social interactions and self-reports on past interactions with a specific technology. You also might want to understand a little bit about users' awareness of the technology. For example, their awareness of existing technology or approaches. And for example, you finally might like to think about some comparisons. So any of the above kind of metrics can then also be measured over time or between different populations. For example, you might run a survey and look at people who are tech savvy versus not tech savvy. These are the types of comparisons that you can run if you have a good survey data set. So So that also begs the question, what kind of things are surveys bad for? And surveys are definitely bad for some activities. For example, surveys are bad at measuring precise behaviors. Users might lie, they might forget, or they might be lazy to fill out your questionnaire. Precise data about specific behaviors should come from automatic logging. Surveys are also bad at looking at underlying motivations. Users might struggle to express their underlying motivations, or they might be unwilling to express these in a survey format. For this type of data, you might need more qualitative, in-depth data. And finally, for basic usability evaluations, surveys are a little bit too coarse or imprecise to provide kind of meaningful comparison, especially if we're thinking about something like usability heuristics where we have well-defined concepts. Surveys are pretty bad at describing these and giving users reasonable options for responding to these types of questions. So again, we would use a different method than a survey if we wanted to do a usability evaluation. So let's talk a little bit about the survey pitfalls. There's a lot of ways that surveys can go wrong. Surveys also, like our quantitative data, need to consider experimental design and confounding factors. Having a well-designed survey question that investigates a single variable is important if you want to actually extrapolate those results and make meaningful conclusions. A common issue, for example, is to ask about multiple dependent variables in a single question. Imagine I ask this question. On a scale of 1 to 5, rate how usable and enjoyable your experience was. If I rate 5, do I mean it was very usable and very enjoyable? Do I mean it was very usable but maybe not very enjoyable? Or I might even mean it was very enjoyable but not very usable. It can be easy to ask these types of questions, which conversationally make sense, but then when we want to actually analyze these in a rigorous way, this introduces a little bit of a confounding factor in our results. Another problem is that you might have low completion rates. If there are repetitive questions, if the survey platform has poor usability, or maybe there's a poor design, you might have low completion rates, which can make it really hard to actually build up enough complete data to make interesting comparisons or interesting results. There's also a lot of problems with noisy data from bad question design. It's very easy to develop bad questions, which is why designing the survey needs to be thoughtful and reflective with an eye towards how you're going to analyze the results. Vague or ambiguous questions provide noisy data that's typically not very useful. And also, there might be biased questions. So we'll talk a lot more about bias in detail, but designing questions such that they lead the respondent to answer in a certain way are also going to give you bad data that is hard to draw good conclusions from.